We're all set up. So I'm Julie Chance, and our topic today is building trust with everything DiSC. And I am joined by my colleague, Deborah Avron, who will be helping me out with the webinar today. So hi, Deborah, and thanks for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
And I want to make sure that I am recording this. So it is being recorded, and I will get everybody a link to it at a later time once we're finished. So if you have any questions or want to go back and look at it, you can do that. So the topic today, as I said, is building trust with everything DiSC. And I'm really passionate about the topic of trust because relationships are built on trust. And if we don't, and when we have relationships where there's trust, we get results through relationships, right? So those trust-based relationships make it so much easier to do the things that we need to do. And I don't know, this is maybe perhaps one of the most important times that we've needed to build trust, because when we're in a stressful time, when people are stressed, their primitive brain or their amygdala kicks in, and we go into a self-preservation mode. And when we're concerned about self-preservation, we become less trustful, right? It's more difficult to trust when we're concerned about what's going to happen to us and we're fearful. So DiSC is a tool for building trust. I think we don't talk about real regularly how DiSC can be a tool for building trust. So I wanted to implicitly do this, and I really wanted to look for a way that particularly those organizations who have invested in trust already can capitalize and leverage that investment during this pandemic. So that's the purpose, or what we're going to cover today. And let's see if I can get to. So for those of you who don't know me, just a little bit about me. My passion is really working with leaders and their teams to get better results with less struggle and stress. And we do that through leadership effectiveness and team development. Because when you have effective leaders and you've got a culture of teamwork, it's a whole lot easier to get things done more quickly. And I took my first DiSC assessment as a young manager in my late 20s, so it's been a few years. And it really profoundly impacted my career in the direction of my career. It really opened me up to some blind spots in my style and in my approach that was keeping me from being as effective as I could be. So that's where my relationship with DiSC came in, and the way that we went about. I went about doing that. And when I started my business, it was a natural to incorporate that. So we have a number of tools. We provide tools and programs that really help leaders and their teams communicate, collaborate, and problem solve so that they can get results. And that includes the Everything DiSC brand, and assessments. It includes the 5 behaviors of a cohesive team assessments, PXT Select hiring assessments, which are all Wiley brands. And then more recently, I've added the Trust Insight assessments, which we'll talk a little bit more about, and we'll look at some of the models with those assessments as we go through this. So the cost of lost trust is high. It's especially high in terms of monetary value. And a researcher, Tony Simon, who's an associate professor at Cornell, did a survey that appeared in the Harvard Business Review, and in this study, he looked at 6,500 employees at 76 Holiday Inn hotels across the United States and Canada to look at what's the impact of employee trust on business results, and particularly that the trust that the employees have in management. And what he found, which probably isn't a big surprise, is that hotels where those employees believed their managers followed through on promises and demonstrated the values they preached were substantially more profitable than those who scored average or lower. And he went on to dig into that data a little bit more. And what he found was that a 1/8 point improvement in a hotel score on a 5-point scale could be expected to increase the hotel's profitability by 2.5% of revenues. And in this study, that was $250,000 per year per hotel. So clearly, there's a huge monetary, and what he found was that no other single aspect of manager behavior that they measured had as large of an impact on profits. So clearly, trust is really important from a monetary perspective. And it's so critical from a monetary perspective. But what are some of the other costs of lost trust? So if anybody wants to chime in, I don't think anybody is muted. I haven't had to mute people yet. But what are some of the other costs of lost trust in addition to monetary costs? Any thoughts on that? Or you can also put it in chat if you're on and want to put it into chat. So
I would imagine, Julie, that commitment and retention would probably be big factors with this as well.
absolutely, commitment, retention. And I think when there's lost trust, there's a huge human cost, a cost in terms of morale, a cost in terms of the impact on individuals and their ability to do their job, how they feel about doing their job. It reminds me of a book that I just finished reading called Upstream, and it's by Dan Heath. And he talks about the importance of going upstream to solve problems. And for me, the going upstream and working on developing trust is a way to solve some of those downstream problems. And we'll look at what some of those downstream problems are. So when employees feel like their managers keep promises and live by the values they describe, they trust their managers more. So, and I think that's intuitively makes sense. And then when they trust their managers more, they become more emotionally committed to the company. They care more deeply about the mission, and they really take more pride in the work they're doing. So if we can develop trust and we can help people develop this more deep commitment and pride in the work they're doing, that's really an upstream intervention that we'll see that then impacts commitment, as you said, Deborah, where they feel greater emotional commitment. They're more willing to stay in their jobs, which ties to the retention piece. And they're willing to go beyond their job descriptions by providing discretionary service and satisfying customer requests. When that occurs, customers experience discretionary service and they feel more satisfied, right? If you're thinking about a hotel, which was in this example, when they experience discretionary service, they're more likely to return to that brand and to that hotel. And then that leads to repeat business, which boosts profits, and also to employee retention, which boosts profits. And I think one of the things that we as facilitators, we as learning and development professionals, we as human resources professionals, one of the things that we can do and really pay attention to as we want the business leaders, the organization as a whole to pay more attention to trust, we can help them connect these dots. And when we help connect the dots, then the investment in those upstream interventions makes more sense. So Tony Simmons, who did this study, has also written a book. It's called The Integrity Dividend, Leading by the Power of Your Word. And I have not yet had an opportunity to read that. However, it has come highly recommended to me. So it will be something a book that I'm going to read in the near future. And so if anybody else reads it and you want to have a book review discussion about it, reach out to me and we can do that. So we're hardwired to more quickly trust those who are similar to us and to distrust those who are different. And that can be, those similarities and differences can be in a whole lot of different ways, but it's a leftover survival mechanism from more prehistoric times. When you think about our tribe was like us, outsiders were different from us. So we tended to trust those who were more similar to us. And to be able to trust people who are different, and when there's differences, we tend to judge those differences, right? We tend to judge people that are different from us. And what we have to be able to do is move from judging differences. If we want trust, we have to be able to move from judging differences up to valuing them. And there's actually a process that we need to go through to do that. And that process is first understanding those differences. And then once we understand the differences, we can begin to respect those differences. Once we respect them, we can appreciate the differences. And then once we appreciate them, we can actually begin to value them. And we can look at how differences, all kinds of differences, whether that's differences in culture or differences in thought style or differences in perspective, differences in experiences, how those broad perspectives can help us be more effective, to get better results, and to do it, quite frankly, with greater ease and flow, or with less struggle and stress. And DiSC is a tool that can help us move through this ladder and this process. I did a session one time, and we're going to combine the DiSC model with a model that's called the Integro model of trust, and we're going to look at how the two work together. One time, though, I think about this judging. Every time I go through this judging and valuing ladder, I think about a story. I think about a session that I was facilitating one time, and the manager, it was a fairly large session, a DiSC session. The manager that was in there with a number of her direct reports and some of her peers. It was a mixed group. It wasn't an intact team. And at the end of the session, the woman, first she apologized to her team for not valuing some of their perspectives. And then she made a statement that's always stuck with me. And I think it is so telling for what DiSC can actually help us do and what happens when we see a broader perspective. She said, now I know that just because someone thinks differently than I do, there's not something wrong with. And I expect her to say me, right? There's not something wrong with me. What she said is, just because, now I know that just because someone thinks differently than I do, I know there's not something wrong with them. And I thought that was just such a great perspective in terms of looking at things and looking and really valuing differences. So we're going to look now, before we jump into talking a little bit more about DiSC, we're going to look at the Integro Trust Model, and specifically we're going to look at those behaviors that build trust. And trust is one of those things it's kind of hard to define, right? Every time I try to define trust, I think about the statement that one of our former Chief Justices, Potter Stewart, infamously said about pornography, which is, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And sometimes it sort of feels like that's how it is with trust. And we may not need to define trust, and I'm not going to try to define trust right now, but we do need to know how to build it. because part of the irony of trust is that just because we're trustworthy doesn't mean other people trust us. So it's about other people's perspectives of whether they can trust us or not about whether we're actually trustworthy, right? So I think that's really, really important to keep in mind. So this is the Integro Trust Model, and it was developed a number of years ago by the Integro Leadership Institute. And it is a research-based model. If any of you are interested in the research around that, I can reach out to me and I can get you the information on that, get you the research reports. And the first behavior is acceptance, that we need to accept people for who they are. We need to accept people that think differently than us, that come at things from a different approach. We need to accept them. And the second one is we need to be open. We need to be open to hearing feedback. We need to be open to giving feedback. We need to be willing to, receptive is a word that comes to mind. And we'll dig into each of these in a little bit more detail. We need to be congruent. And when I think about congruency, I think about walking the talk. I think about, and this is where I think a congruency, one of the places where I see organizations not being as congruent as they could be or as they might need to be, is around values, right? So they put values up on the wall, they put their mission statement up on the wall, yet nobody's doing that. And that's incongruence. And that leads to a breakdown of trust. I think we've probably all experienced that at some level or another. And then the fourth behavior is reliability. I'll do what I say I'll do. I'll follow through. I will complete what I say I'm going to complete. You can count on me. So those are four behaviors. We're going to dig into those a little bit deeper. But before we delve into those, I want to just remind everybody and walk through the DiSC model, because in a minute we're going to put these two models together. So this is the DiSC model. It's the same model. You might be more familiar with the circular model, but we're going to look at it just a little bit differently here. And you're probably a little bit more used to seeing behaviorally oriented words on the axis. So things like at the top, fast-paced, assertive, dynamic, bold. At the bottom, thoughtful, calm, methodical. To the left, the questioning, logic-focused, skeptical. And on the right-hand side, we're more used to seeing things like accepting, people-focused, empathizing. And those are behaviors, right, or tend to be more behaviors. And I think when we're looking at trust, it's helpful to go beyond the behaviors a little bit, which are on the surface. If you think of an iceberg, that's what we can see on the surface, and go a little bit deeper into what's actually driving those behaviors. What are the needs behind those behaviors? So on the top axis, the top half of this, we see that the people who fall into the dominance and influence categories tend to have a higher need for control, while those on the lower part have a lower need for control. And that need for control drives our behaviors, the behaviors that are associated with those styles. To the left, we see affiliation is on the horizontal axis. And to the left, we see a lower need for affiliation and a higher need for affiliation on the right. So it drives some of those needs that we see in each of those. So the need for achievement is a key need for the D style. They prioritize getting things done, getting results, challenging the status quo and challenging others. And they fear a loss of control. Remember, they have that high need for control. So they also have a fear of vulnerability, of looking vulnerable, of coming across vulnerable. And we want to keep that in mind as we go through this next piece. Then the I has a high need for recognition. they express enthusiasm. They like to be in social settings and group activities, and they have a fear of loss of influence. So they want to continue to be influential, and we'll see how some of this plays out with trust in a minute. And then the steadiness style, they have a need for acceptance. They want to be accepted. They are very team-oriented, like to get input and make sure, and a need for harmony. And we'll see on the fear side, they've got a fear of disappointing others. They also dislike conflict and don't want to offend others. And keep that in mind as well as we go through to this next one. And then the conscientiousness style has a need for correctness. They want quality. They want things to be done right. They like to be able to have enough time to do the kind of work that they feel like they want to do. And their fear is criticism of what they do. They also don't like being wrong, and they don't like slipshod methods. So this is an overview, just as a reminder. So we kind of ground set, because I think most everybody on here probably has some understanding of DiSC. We're going to look at that Integro Trust Model again. And which of these, when you think about these, well, let me ask you before we do that, let me ask you a question. When you think about yourself, so which of these behaviors is the easiest for you, and which is the most difficult? So just take a second and think about yourself. Which one? Because here's the thing: we've got to have all four of these if we're going to have the highest level of trust relationships that we can. None of them come easy. All of them don't come easy to everybody. So we're all going to have ones that come easier and ones that we struggle with. So Deborah, which one do you think is the easiest for you?
I know I've been staring at them, trying to figure out my best one here. I think congruence is pretty easy for me.
Okay.
You know, I'm usually kind of a bottom line kind of person. So I think I usually say what I mean. And if it doesn't look like I'm getting through, I usually try to clarify. So I think that one's easy.
Okay, awesome. And which one would be the most difficult for you?
You know, I was looking at openness, and I'm very good at giving feedback. Sometimes I don't like to hear it. Could that be openness?
Yeah. So
It
there's
says give and ask.
we're going to actually build this model out in a little bit more detail in just a minute, and we'll see that receptivity is a piece of it, as is sharing a piece of it. So yeah. So think about that, and for me, I would say congruence is probably the easiest for me. And the hardest for me is probably acceptance. Although I have learned the importance of it over the years. I talked about earlier in as we started the session, I talked about taking my DiSC profile many years ago when I was in my late 20s. And one of the things that I learned from that experience was that if I was going to get the kinds of results I wanted to get and have the working relationships that I needed to get those results, that acceptance was one of the things I needed to really work on. So acceptance is probably the hardest, although I've learned to do it. So and openness is also difficulty, both from not just from the receptivity piece, but also from the, I'm very willing to give feedback, but I'm not always as receptive to it, nor am I always real open to share more personal information, which helps build trust, right? So let's break this model out a little bit. Well, before I do that, I'm going to go back for just a second. So which of the DiSC styles, and this is generalizations, right? Because this model, you can't overlay this model perfectly over the DiSC model, but there certainly is some correlation and some relationship between the two models. So when you think about this model, What do you, which DiSC style do you think probably has the more difficult time with acceptance? And anybody that's got access to chat, we are watching chat on Zoom. We're not watching it on YouTube because there's only so much we can watch. We haven't gotten that good at multitasking yet. So any thoughts, if anybody has the ability to put in chat, or Deborah, your thoughts?
Maybe the dominant style.
Yeah, that's what we tend to see, is that dominance or the D style has the most difficulty with acceptance. You think about, sometimes we say the motto for that style is my way or the highway, right? So it's hard to accept other, and you know, full transparency and disclosure, that is my style. So I'm not talking out of school here. And who do you think it's maybe the easiest for? Any thoughts?
Probably that steadiness style.
Yeah,
because their need is, you know, they like the harmony, and we all need to get along. So I would think maybe they're, you know, to quote another saying, as you did before, I'm okay, you're okay, maybe.
Yeah, that's a good one. And openness might be what we typically see with openness is that the I style or the influence style has the easiest time being open. There may be a little bit of trouble with that receptivity piece in terms of hearing the feedback, right? Because of that high need for control and not wanting to lose that influence. But they're typically pretty easy for them to share feelings and share information about themselves, which often helps build trust. And then the most difficult one for openness tends to be that seer conscientiousness style, I think, which makes sense because they're pretty private, right? And don't necessarily like to share a lot of information. When we think about congruence, and we'll see in a minute that congruence has a lot to do with straightforwardness, it's probably the D style that's the easiest for. And the S style often has difficulty with giving that direct feedback, with walking into situations that might be conflictual and dealing with them head on. And then reliability, the easiest tends to be the C or the conscientiousness style. And sometimes, and again, these are generalizations, sometimes the I or influence style has some trouble with reliability because they like to move from project to project, and they can get excited about new things, which makes it more difficult sometimes to follow through. So let's unpack this model a little bit more now. And we're going to look at some of the things that we need to we're going to build the model out a little bit more and look at each of these in a little bit more detail so that we can maybe actually make them more useful. So when we're talking about acceptance, we need to accept people, to feel accepted. We need to respect and show respect and recognition. So when we think about trust and we think about the need to value those differences and respect differences and give people recognition. Openness has to do with receptivity, right? Which is part of what we talked about a minute ago about being open to hearing input, open to hearing what other people's thoughts are, open to hearing dissenting views, and as well as disclosure. So, and being willing to disclose information, and not just personal information, but information as we think about an organization, to give people the information that they need to know what's going on and understand and develop that trust. Congruence has to do with straightforwardness, which we've talked a little bit about, and then honesty. And one of the things I really want to point out here is that honesty doesn't have anything to do with DiSC style. every style. You can have people in every style that are honest and people in every style that are dishonest. So as we go through this the rest of the time, when we talk about congruence, we're really going to be talking about straightforwardness, not honesty, because honesty spans the style circumflex. And then reliability is really about seeking excellence and keeping commitments. So do I keep my commitments, and do I seek excellence in everything that I do? So this is the model built out a little bit more. And if you think about, okay, and in a minute, I'm going to give you an idea for an activity if you want to take this back and do it. When you think about, okay, the one that I struggle the most with is acceptance. So how do I develop that acceptance skill? How do I become more accepting? And it's to find those things that I respect about somebody else, and then provide them recognition. And that's true with each of those, is that's what we do. How do I become more reliable in the eyes of others so that they will trust me? It's by keeping my commitments or not overcommitting. So to really become cognizant of not overcommitting, and then to seek excellence. So if there's any questions anybody has, if you want to type them into chat, or if you want to raise your hand, we can see your raised hands and we can answer those questions.
And I'm reviewing the chat box. So if anyone wants to type anything in, I'll be reading those to Julie so she can answer your questions.
Yeah, and if we run out of time, or if you've got questions later, I can always send them. I will be sending the recording out to everybody, so we can get you answers to those questions as well. So feel free to email me as well if you don't have access to chat, and we'll get them answered and get them out to you. So what the research showed on this was that there was actually 2 subscales, and that those subscales split down the way you see the line right now. And one of those was really about communication. One of those subscales was about communication, and the other one was about consistency. And so as a leader, or as we work with leaders, if we want to build trust and we want to simplify that approach a little bit, focus on communication and consistency. However, and if you look at the kind of the top right hand side of this model, where this is really aligns with the work of Amy Edmondson, the Harvard professor that developed and popularized the concept of psychological safety. This really has a lot to do with psychological safety, that acceptance, the freedom to be who you are, that openness. And it also has a lot to do with Patrick Lencioni's work around vulnerability-based trust. So this side is really, that upper right-hand side is really about that psychological safety and vulnerability-based trust. And I've always believed, and I do believe, that that's a really important part of having a trusted environment and a high-performing team. However, it's always felt a little bit incomplete, because I think that consistency, or what we can think of as predictability-based trust, is also important. And so we got to pay attention to both of those. And probably like you, one of the biggest complaints I hear from staff, from team members, from employees throughout an organization is we don't get enough communication. And then what I hear from the leadership and the managers is I give them more information, and I give them more information, and we're doing that, and there's this disconnect. And I think that disconnect is there because when people say, I need more communication, they aren't asking for more information. They're asking for more dialogue. Yeah. They're asking to be heard. They're asking for a greater level of transparency or disclosure. They're asking for some recognition. So I think this model can help us think about not only that we need to have communication to build that trust, but it gives us some information on the type of communication we need to have. So now let's look at how we put this trust model together with DiSC. And some of this will look familiar to you. So the strength of the dominant style tends to be straightforwardness, that item associated with congruence, right? The challenge or the strength for the influence tends to be openness, particularly in terms of the disclosure piece. The strength for steadiness tends to be acceptance, and for conscientiousness, it tends to be reliability. So you can see these are the three of the behaviors plus straightforwardness, which is from congruence from the trust model. And then when we look at the weaknesses, we start to see something really interesting, that the challenge for the dominant style is acceptance, which is the strength for the steadiness style. And we judge others, what we most value, what is easiest for us, what our strength is, also tends to be what we most value. And it's how we judge others.
Mhm.
So we have this scenario where, as the D style really values straightforwardness, and when they're dealing with somebody from the steadiness style, who is, we'll see, let me just go ahead and finish this out. We'll see straightforwardness a challenge. We can start to see why those relationships develop where there isn't as much trust as there could be. So when you think about somebody with the influence style, who openness comes easy and sharing comes easy, who's dealing with somebody with the conscientiousness style where that's more difficult, and they start to, it's so, okay, well, what are they not telling me? What are they hiding, right? Could be what the I person starts to say. The C person, this conscientiousness style, or the person with the conscientiousness style, starts to say, they'll tell anybody a lot of personal information. I can't trust my personal information with them. So we see how these different strengths and challenges play out from the trust model, play out with the DiSC style. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually look at some ideas for action. So how can you, especially those of you whose organizations may have already invested in DiSC, how can you take this information and use it now during a time when trust, even in organizations where everything's been done to maintain trust, even in organizations where information, there's been good communication, good sharing, because of the high levels of stress that we're experiencing, we're likely to have some trust issues, or that the trust may not be as high as it was previously or as high as it needs to be. So we're going to look at some ideas for action that you can actually take out of here and use with your teams, use within your organizations. And the first one is the first idea for action is to build a trust action plan. And this is something you could actually implement as a short virtual training session. All of this can be done virtually, because I know a lot of places are still virtual, or at least partially virtual right now. So I put in chat this URL that there's actually a worksheet that you can take people through. We're not going to go through the worksheet. but I'm going to present you with the challenge for each one of these styles. And then if you want to take people through that worksheet or go through it yourself, you can do that. So the D is to identify the challenge is acceptance. So the scenario would be to identify a situation where you, as the D person, got impatient or irritated with someone, rather than accepting them for not being as quick as you would like, or for whatever that you're judging them on. And then think about how you could go through that. For the I individual, the challenge is to identify a situation where they failed to keep a commitment, and because they got distracted by something more excited. For the S, it's to identify a situation where you agreed to do something that you didn't want to do because you felt uncomfortable about saying no. And then for the C, it's to identify a situation where you kept information to yourself that would have been helpful to others because you weren't 100% sure it was correct. And that's one of the things that each of these, when we do these things, we do them because, because we feel like let me use the C as an example, or the conscientious style as an example here. They withhold information or don't put the information forward because they're not 100% sure it's correct. Yet and they don't want to damage their reputation, right? By putting information out there that's not 100% correct. However, by withholding the information or not putting it out there, it ends up damaging their reputation because nobody has this information to act on and make decisions. And we can look at every one of the styles in that way and say, the S style, they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, right? They don't want to get into a conflictual situation. But is it kind to not be straightforward and give somebody the truth if that can help them improve? Mm-hmm. Is that really a kind thing to do? So it's sort of by doing what we think is going to meet our need, it ends up backfiring on us. So with straightforwardness, I always think of the situation where somebody is not upfront with another person about their performance, mm-hmm. and aren't giving them all along the way because they don't want to hurt their feelings. They don't want to be unkind. They don't want to get into the conflict, whatever the reason is. And then all of a sudden it gets so bad that the person has to be let go. Mm-hmm. Well, it hasn't been kind to withhold that information. So to think through, to help people see, because we're asking people to change behavior, right? We're asking them to become more accepting when that's a difficult thing for them to do, or to pay more attention to following through on commitments when that doesn't come naturally. And what we have to do is we have to help people see how by doing those things, it really helps them get the outcomes they want. And by not doing them, it gets in the way of getting the outcomes they want. So the first idea for action is to build a trust action plan. The second is to really help people begin to value and see the value that each style brings to the team. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we probably don't spend enough time on often when we're talking about DiSC. And is one of the real, I think, values or benefits of DiSC. So I would actually look at, especially where you've got situations that intact teams may have done DiSC, is equip and encourage the managers to have discussions that move their team members from judging to valuing. That ladder, remember the judging to valuing ladder? Mm-hmm. And there's what you're seeing on the screen now is page 7 from the Everything DiSC workplace profile. So if people have taken that, you can have them pull that out, look at that, and then think about a current project or a current situation that the team's working on, and look at what value does each style bring to that project or that situation. And or is there a style that you can draw from more than what maybe you are right now to help move the situation or the project forward? So the real value of this information is how do you integrate it into day-to-day work? And this is an activity that you can use to actually help managers integrate and make this more a part of the culture. The third idea for action is to actually measure trust. And if you're going to make a change or implement a change, facilitate change, do something differently, it helps to know where you're actually starting, right? I always think about those maps in the mall that say, you know, it shows you where everything is. And every now and then I find one of those maps that's all really nice and well, but the "you are here" map dot isn't on it. And it's pretty much useless. So this is one of the Trust Insight assessments, the Employee Passion Survey. And if trust is something that you really want to look at with your organization, if it's an area you feel like you need some work, then reach out, because this survey actually measures how important the trust values are, as well as how well they're being met. So the individual, how important it is wherever is the gray line with the dots, and how well they're being met are those colored circles. So, and then this survey also looks at 5 employee needs and how well those are being used. And then the final idea for action is probably my favorite idea for action. And this is, again, for those teams and those individuals who have taken a DiSC profile, or if it's something you're looking at implementing, is encourage team members to have coffee virtually, in person, however they're meeting right now, and review comparison reports. And those of you who are familiar with everything DiSC know that comparison reports come at no additional charge to anybody who has taken a everything DiSC profile. So you want to encourage them to meet. I have a client that every time they do a DiSC session or they do a team building, team development session, one of the things that they do out of that, one of the action items out of that, is that they require each of the team members to have coffee and go through the comparison report with each of the other team members. And I think I think that is the reason that they actually invest in DiSC, is so that they can get, or 5 behaviors. You can get comparison reports with either one that they get with that. So have them look at 2 things. One is similarities, and the information that they get includes a number of different scales. One of the scales is where they're the most similar, and then there's some other scales where they're different. But actually have them, I've seen when I've done this with people, and not even said, look at your similarities, but when they debrief, one of the ahas or takeaways is how similar they are. And it's like, wow, we're totally, she's a D and I'm an S, and you know, it looks like we're don't have anything in common at all. And yet we're really similar in these areas. And that's one of the things. Similarities, identifying similarities helps build trust. Valuing differences helps build trust. So this is actually Deborah and I's comparison report. She was kind enough to let me share it. And this is just 2 of the items. And it looks like we're both pretty frank. And we both need to remember to listen and give some emphasis to that. And then to pay attention, the fact that we're both frank could mean that sometimes we're too frank, right? So
everyone's going to think we're downright rude to one another, but you know, it seems to work. But
so then the other is I selected another continuum where we're more distant, and I selected this one for a very specific reason. Is remember, providing praise, it wasn't the word used in the model is not praise. The model uses is recognition, right? That those people who struggle with acceptance can give more recognition, or to build trust around acceptance, use acceptance to build trust. You need to give recognition, which is related to praise, right? So Deborah is much more generous with praise than I am. I'm much more selective. So I can use her to help me, and her skill in that to help me be more accepting. So this is some ways to use the comparison reports. And right now, comparison reports can be run through myeverythingdisc.com, which is a mobile site. That's where these continuum came from. They can also be run from the Epic account for those of you that utilize DiSC and use it internally. Mm-hmm. Those are the two ways it can be done right now. There is soon to be a third way called Catalyst. And I'm not going to be going into Catalyst right now. It's a new platform that those of you that are familiar with myeverythingdisc.com know it can be a little bit clunky sometimes, can be a little bit hard for people to use. And this new platform really takes away that clunkiness, as well as adds a number of features. And I'll be reaching out with more information on Catalyst. But right now there's two ways to do that: myeverythingdisc.com, or the Epic administrator can run those reports. And then so those are the ideas, 4 ideas for action. If there's any questions, we can take questions. We got a couple of minutes for questions, and nobody is muted, I don't think. You may have yourselves muted, but I don't have anybody muted, I don't believe. So if you've got questions, or feel free to reach out at another time, or via email. I'm happy to do that. So if there aren't any questions, or if there are, we'll go ahead and you can still put them in. So my question to you would be, what action will you commit to taking in this next week to be a catalyst within your organization to help maintain, enhance, build, or rebuild trust? What's one action that you can take?
Again, I'm monitoring the chat. If anybody wants to share a thought, be glad to read it off to Julie.
And again, we're only, so if anybody in the YouTube chat is chatting in YouTube, we're only monitoring the Zoom, but I will look at the YouTube chat and respond to that. All right, then. With that, please feel free to reach out. If we're not connected already on LinkedIn, I'd love to connect on LinkedIn. My email address is there. You can email me. And also my LinkedIn address is there. And the website is there as well. So feel free to reach out. Thanks for being here. Deborah, thank you for helping me out with this. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. You did a great job, Julie. This is the first time I've seen this presentation all the way through. So it made a lot of sense to me. Thank you for sharing it.
Great, thank you. Thanks to everybody that's been here. And with that, I am going to go ahead and end the meeting. I'm not seeing any questions, but thanks again for being here. And I will send you, assuming that I was able to actually record it, which it looks like I did. Looks like I did record it. I will get the recording out to everyone. So thanks again for being here. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to see each other in person, especially those of you who are local in the DFW area soon. Have a great rest of the week.